So I want to go ahead and start talking about the story. Our main character is Thomas Builds the Fire, and Thomas has been silent for more than 20 years. And there's some implication that every time Thomas speaks, it sets off this sort of chain reaction in which everybody who hears him feels impassioned or inflamed and wants to rise up against all oppressors. And because of this, authorities have sort of forced this silence on him. So Thomas has been living in silence for 20 years, and he started to make noises just recently. And you can tell this is sort of in the contemporary time period. There's references to being in jail, the BIA, which is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a sort of contemporary police force, if you will. And just his making little noises has caused people to start pushing against their oppressors. And so they have put him into jail, and there's a trial that commences. And in the midst of this trial, Thomas starts telling stories of things that happened in 1858. And then he is eventually, at the very end of the novel, you see this news article, which was written in the 1900s. He's eventually sent to prison in a more contemporary time period. He rides the bus to prison. So there's this interesting use of a nonlinear plot here, and also references to historical events. There's also a fictionalizing of historical events, and in that fictionalizing, we get some of that use of metaphor common in Native American literature. So remember here that in these two columns, on the left side, you have characteristics of Native American literature as influenced by the oral literary tradition, and on the right side, you have postmodern characteristics. So I mentioned already that there is this article at the end of the story. And then if you flip through, you'll see some other interesting elements. So on page 95 at the top, it says, "The following report is adapted from the original court transcript." And from here on, the author uses this third-person objective narration. So in third-person objective, we don't get anybody's thoughts and feelings. And in part, that is meant to reflect this kind of court transcript where if you're a court reporter, you don't know what the witnesses or the prosecution or the defense is thinking. All that you know is what they say and what they do. And that is characteristic of third-person objective narration. So you see a bit of like court reporting going on, and then if you flip ahead to page 96, you'll see a letter. So notice that throughout the narrative, the story, there's this court report, there's a letter, there's a newspaper article, all of these things mixed together, all of these different genres mixed together. That's pastiche. We're putting together all these different elements, okay? There are also some real historical references in the story. So if you flip to page 96, you'll see references to the year 1858. This is an important time period as this references the Yakima War from 1855 to 1858. The Yakima War, which actually involves multiple tribes, including the Coeur d'Alene Indians and the Spokane Indians. Remember, Sherman Alexie himself is Spokane. At the end of this war, there is a battle called the Battle of Four Lakes. And this battle goes so badly for the Native Americans that they're forced onto reservations after this point. So this is a turning point for the Yakima, Spokane, and Coeur d'Alene Indians. It's an important historical event. And Colonel Wright, who is mentioned in this story, was in charge of that campaign, in charge of that war. And then if you flip to the very end, if you flip to page 102, in that newspaper article, you'll see the name of the judge. His name is Judge Wright. So the author is trying to make connections between past and present, past and present. On page 98, he mentions Qual Chan. Qual Chan, who was eventually executed by Colonel Wright under the flag of treaty, under a white flag. This is actually, again, another historical event. So in the midst of the Yakima War, Qual Chan, who was the nephew of the chief of the Yakima tribe, goes into Colonel Wright's camp under a flag of truce and is hanged, along with his wife and a few of his supporters. So here's this other kind of historical reference here. Obviously, he fictionalizes some of this as well. So he makes actual historical references and then he fictionalizes those references. So when he talks about being a young warrior who almost dies, when he talks about the ponies, this is all historiographic metafiction. The ponies is an interesting story too, and that might have been confusing for some of you, but if you'll note, there are 800 ponies. He's one of 800. And then if you flip ahead to the battle where he fought as Wild Coyote, as one of the young warriors, you'll notice that there were 800 warriors as well, that he was one of those 800. So he's making a connection here between actual native warriors and ponies or horses. And this is definitely metaphor, and he may be doing this for a number of reasons. One, in the American imagination, Indians, Native Americans, and horses kind of go hand in hand. When we think Native Americans, we tend to think horses or ponies. Two, there's this reference to nature here, so there's maybe part of that ecocentric view here. In part, this idea that animals are not vindictive, or they don't demand ownership of land. They sort of live on the land and are innocent. And so when the horses are slaughtered, and if the horses are meant to represent warriors or soldiers, he's making an argument here, I think, about the irrationality or the cruelty of the Europeans, the Americans, and the way that they treated Native Americans. Okay, so by and large, that sums up most of the generic elements that we find in the story. What I want to switch to real quickly is talking about some of the themes that are present in the text. So if you'll flip to the very beginning, I want to talk about the author's use of intertextuality. The author begins his story with a quote by Franz Kafka. It reads, "Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K., for without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning." So this is a quote from the trial by Franz Kafka, and it's a story about a man who was arrested for an unspecified crime by an unspecified power. So the author here is talking a little bit about the concept of justice, how justice is this kind of ephemeral thing, how justice is really something that is determined by those who have power, and that those who are oppressed often don't receive justice. If you'll notice, at the end of the story, Thomas is asked if he murdered 2 soldiers in cold blood. Thomas lives in contemporary time, so in the late 1900s, if you will. But he's asked about murders that happened in the mid 1800s, at a time when he couldn't possibly have been alive. So he's basically sent to prison. He's convicted of a crime that he himself didn't do, but that an earlier generation committed, that an earlier Indian committed. In other words, Thomas is being arrested and imprisoned for being Indian. And so the author is making this argument about how race and power often give certain groups power and allow them to enact what they see as justice on disempowered groups. You'll see that also reflected at the end of the story as well. So Thomas looked at these 5 men, this is in the last paragraph, who shared his skin color, at the white man who shared this bus that was going to deliver them to a new kind of reservation, barrio, ghetto, logging town shack. He looked out the window through the steel grates on the windows at the freedom just outside the glass. He saw wheat fields, bodies of water, the bodies of dark-skinned workers pulling fruit from trees and sweat from the air. A little bit earlier, a few paragraphs up, it mentions that Thomas is riding that bus with 4 African men, 1 Chicano and 1 white man, who was from the smallest town in the state. So this white man is impoverished. And so basically he's making this argument about how being a person of color or being a person who is poor makes you disempowered and then more likely to be a victim of the wealthy white man's justice. It's interesting to note too that both the Colonel Wright who killed Qualchan and slaughtered the ponies is the same Colonel Wright, or is it has the same name as the judge, whose name is Judge James Wright. And Judge James Wright has a tendency to silence Thomas. So Thomas has been silent for 20 years because every time he speaks, he seems to impassion people. Notice the name Thomas builds the fire. He literally builds a fire in the people who hear him, who listen to him. And so he is constantly being silenced. And in fact, at one point, Thomas is telling his story, and the judge silences him, and he says, "That's it. The defense testimony is over." And so he's not allowed to tell his stories anymore because the judge realizes the effect they have. What the author is talking about here is not only that justice is sort of limited to those who have power, but also the right to tell the story is limited to those who have power. Winston Churchill once said that history is written by the victors. And in this case, for Native Americans, that is especially true. Often when we think about Native Americans, we think about them only in the past tense, wearing war paint and head feathers and riding bare-chested on horses with bows and arrows in their hands, or dancing around fires, living in teepees. And this is not a story that they necessarily tell. This is a story that is created and told by white Western culture, primarily through the media. So, in many ways, Native Americans have been silenced, much like Thomas has been silenced. And the people that get to tell their story are the people who have power. In this case, the wealthy white culture, wealthy white Western culture, gets to tell the story of the Native American. And their story has actually, their true story has been silenced by this wealthy white power. So the author is making an argument about truth, what really is truth, um, and and what is history, and are those two the same? And often they're not. History is, facts and dates, but it's not always truth, especially when certain people's stories get sort of taken out of history, edited out of history. So if you don't hear the Native American story, or even the contemporary Native American story, then you're not hearing the whole truth. You're just getting some facts and some dates, and we call that history. So when Thomas starts talking and people become impassioned by that, the author is also making an argument about the importance of telling your story when you can. When Thomas starts to tell his story, the people react in a very interesting way. So Thomas is telling the story, and he opens his eyes. He opens his eyes, and he saw that the Indians in the courtroom sat up straight and combed their braids gracefully and smiled with Indian abandon. By telling stories, by telling his truth, he empowers his people. And so, yes, it's true that there are people who are oppressed, people who are poor, people of color, women, etc. But when those people tell their own stories, they empower not only themselves, but others like them. So when Sherman Alexie writes this story, when Thomas Builds the Fire tells his story, he empowers those people around him. And when Sherman Alexie tells or writes his stories, he empowers all Native peoples around him. And not just Native peoples. As you can tell from that last page of the story, he's working to empower all oppressed people. And that's what this whole story is about. It's basically a moral about justice and history and truth, and how if we want justice and if we want history to reflect the truth, we all have to be willing to tell our own stories and to listen to the stories of others, especially those who don't have the exact same experience that we have. Okay, so that's the end of our Thomas Builds the Fire lesson. What you're going to do now is take the Thomas Builds the Fire quiz, and then before the week is out, you will move on to the homegoing unit, the excerpt from homegoing, the chapter titled "Ya."